All right, here we go with the last video. And in this video, I'm going to be concentrating on bureaucracy and gender. And that's because that's exactly what the author does, is look specifically at the issues around bureaucracy and how bureaucracies and educational organizations have a particular gendered characteristic. And as a result of that, some of the issues that emanate from that and some of the ideas that we might think about in making changes around that that would be more equitable for both women and men in organizations. The author is Stephen K. Jull. I'm guessing at the pronunciation of his last name because I don't know him. Did look him up, and he's an interesting fellow. He teaches at the University of Cambridge, and he is has a particular location in the Center for Commonwealth Education, which has a particular focus on social justice and equity around various issues. In this particular one, he's taking up the issue of gender. He also is the COO, CFO of GeoGebra, which for those mathematicians of you in the group, you might want to look that up. It has some interesting ideas, apps, etc. So obviously he has varied interests. In this article, he's looking at locating gender bias and systemic discrimination in public schooling bureaucracy. And he has published it in the Alberta Journal of Educational Research. It's an interesting article because there aren't a lot that are specific to issues of bureaucracy, and yet bureaucracy is something that shapes our practices in such distinctive and powerful ways. So let's look at the whole issue of bureaucracy. And as he says in his paper, bureaucracy itself is biased, and there's certainly lots of organizational theorists who have looked at the whole issue of bureaucracy and would concur with that. From his perspective, they're inherently gender biased. Weber, Max Weber, who was a German philosopher, and looked particularly at organizations, and became known for the whole notion of bureaucracy and hierarchy, particularly rules, the rules of bureaucracy. He came up with what he called a model of the ideal bureaucracy. Now, he didn't mean by that it was the ideal in the sense of you should do this. What he was doing was looking at all of the bureaucracies that were emerging with the beginnings of industrialization and issues around how organizations were emerging and being organized, and took key characteristics of these various organizations that he looked at, various bureaucracies that he looked at, and came up with the ideal in the philosophical sense. It's important to recognize that, of course, because he was looking at specific bureaucracies at the time that he was doing this research in the 1800s, it reflected the norms at the time. And so these norms, the problem is these norms have continued to be perpetuated. And these norms included a formal hierarchy, so a hierarchy that was formalized to various specific positions, and attached to those positions was a flow of power. So the power flowed from the top to the bottom, and while there might be conversations from the bottom to the top, it had to flow through the various layers of the bureaucracy. It was management by rules. There were specific rules around what one could and couldn't do, what the expectations were and were not, and people were expected to conform to those. The bureaucracy was organized by functional specialty. So those as you look at the hierarchy that forms the bureaucracy, you see people occupying certain strata, and those strata were defined by the specialized skills that they held. Employment was based on technical qualifications, so you couldn't be hired unless you could prove specific kinds of technical qualifications, which of course has implications for how we construct our education system as well. And it was thought to be impersonal. Now, anyone who's worked in an organization can attest to the fact that it was never impersonal, but that was the ideal. And the ideal strove for impersonality because it would be therefore meritocratic, so it wouldn't depend on your connections and so on. It would be fair and it would be efficient. It was therefore perceived that a hierarchy of this kind within a bureaucracy would be, so the bureaucracy itself would be stable, rational, efficient, impersonal, and this would lead to greater productivity. Now, this was the ideal because previous to organizing around bureaucracies, things were kind of done ad hoc. You know, whoever could do it did it, and it was somewhat inefficient. It was not always, didn't always work out well, because if there wasn't somebody there who knew how to do something, then it didn't get done, and it didn't get done properly. And so, you know, so it was inefficient in a lot of ways. So certainly bureaucracies are very efficient, but they aren't always as efficient as one might presuppose, given these characteristics of a bureaucracy. The other thing that, of course, Jull points out is that if bureaucratic norms are premised on male norms, and of course they were, if you look at that hierarchy, you will see that it's highly stratified in a gendered way. So as these organizations were organized, women were hired to be the secretaries, and there would be big offices filled up with desks and typewriters on those desks and big filing cabinets, and their responsibility was to do that kind of work. Whereas the men were the ones who were in positions of power. And they also formed the strata, which was outside of the bureaucracy but was governed by the bureaucracy, the workforce that actually did the work of the organization. So the you know, the manufacturing strata. So because it was organized around gender norms, could it be meritocratic? Could a woman who would like to have been considered for a position of authority be considered? Well, obviously not, especially at that time. So this means then that these gender norms were entrenched in the hierarchy, in the bureaucracy. So then he talks about situating bureaucratic gender bias, gender hegemony, and teaching. Now, by hegemony, we mean that those norms that become entrenched, we could call it the status quo, except that hegemony is not something that we can say, oh, I'm acting in a hegemonic way. Hegemony operates by people perpetuating norms. And so it becomes something that's very difficult to push outside of. And so a gendered hegemony are those actions and systems that hold gender norms in place and make it very difficult for people to get outside of them. So what he argues is that current models of schooling are arguably a model of capitalist bureaucratic efficiency. So these organizations, these bureaus, were organized around an emerging capitalism, a capitalism premised on industrialization. So schools were organized within that model, and they haven't changed a lot since. We can look at very old schools, and while new schools are glitzier, they're still organized with long hallways, classrooms off those hallways. There are very few other kinds of models that one could point to as being different than this kind of industrial efficiency. So, of course, the reason that they were organized in this way was to increase efficiency and effectiveness. So not only was the physical building or the physical environment organized in a particular kind of way, bureaucratically, but the systems, the educational systems themselves were organized that way as well. Someone at the top, a row of people who assisted that leader and with very specific kinds of skill sets that they could use, finance, transportation, etc., etc. Those who assisted them in the offices, and then those who actually did the work that the bureau put into motion. Interestingly, historically, teaching was a male endeavor because it was entrepreneurial. So somebody would come into town, they would set up shop, hang a shingle outside their door, a school teacher, schooling available. Parents would pay for it, and their students would go. So it was classed as well as gendered. So these men were itinerant. They might settle down in one location if they had a family or whatever, but basically they were itinerant. They moved from location to location where there was an interest in developing a small school to serve the needs of the children of that community. When when schools began to be organized in more bureaucratic ways, however, as populations increased, cities began to be formed, etc., men became the administrators and women became the teachers. So women were able to enter into the teaching strata of the bureaucracy, but they were not able to take up administrative positions. He argues as well that what we know about schooling and schools and how schools are organized and who does what was largely ignored in the research about schools because this public-private split was perpetuated in the organizational arrangements of the school. So those characteristics that were sought after in the private sphere, where women did the caring work of the home, etc., caring for others, taking care of the home, etc., was mirrored to some degree by what teachers did in classrooms. And men who went off to work and did the stuff that they do in organizational settings, that was mirrored by the principals and the inspectors and so on that were part of the bureaucracies of the time. So because there wasn't a lot of analysis of what was going on, schools just kept reflecting those norms rather than calling them into question. It hasn't been really until very recently that there has been a questioning of those norms. So the result of a gendered bureaucracy then was a skewed number of men in administration and women in teaching roles. And those numbers have remained more or less the same. So women, the numbers have varied from about 70 to 80% of women in teaching, and about 20% male, and it's almost exactly the reverse in administration. So about 80% males, or 80 to 90% at times, males in administration, and only about 10 to 20% of females. Now that number has shifted, and it depends on the part of the organization that you're looking at. And again, this is shaped by gender norms. So at the elementary level, we have more women in administrative positions. At the secondary level, we have fewer. When we get to the board offices, consultancy roles tend to be held mostly by women because they're the kind of the helpers. They go out into the schools and do that sort of work. But those who are in positions of power, they tend to be held by men. So we have this hierarchy then of power, where we have principals and expertise, where we have consultants. Now that doesn't mean that those in the hierarchy of power don't have expertise, but it's mostly the exercise of power that they're doing in the jobs that they hold. And then what are the outcomes then of a gendered public schooling bureaucracy? Well, as we've said, we have a skewed gender representation by role, as well as opportunities for promotion. And this goes back to some of the things that we talked about earlier in the course, where access to information about promotions, etc., tended to be held within circles that were populated by men. So women didn't have access to that information. Some of that's changing, and it depends on the board, but there have been some changes with that. Hegemonic masculinity has negative effects for non-conforming men. So men who are more feminized, men who are gay, men who just don't conform to the kind of male club, they suffer many of the same sorts of things that women do in terms of promotion, etc. All of this organizational, this gendered organizational hierarchy filters into the classroom as well, so that power over management rather than power with, which tends to be a more female, not always, but a more female-oriented notion of how one exercises power, is seen as fundamental. a principal must be in control of their school and must demonstrate that control in particular kinds of ways. And both men and women who are in positions of power and authority, such as principals, are expected to demonstrate this model of management, which has implications for women in positions of authority as well. Sometimes very negative positions if they step outside of those expectations of how power is demonstrated, or if they do exercise those kinds of power models, because then they're seen as, well, you know the words. So it's a kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't position to be in a sense. Now, many women work through that and are able to do their work very successfully. So I don't mean to set this up as something that women must suffer and will continue to suffer all of their lives. But it does mean that there is a period, at least, when one starts in a school or begins a position where, that must be negotiated. Reforms initiated by women are frequently opposed by male teachers as well, which was an interesting finding that he quotes. And I can think of examples of that very thing happening. Or, the model of sitting around a table talking, and a woman sitting at the table says something, puts out an idea, and it's kind of ignored and it goes on. And then about 15 minutes later, one of the men in the group brings up the same idea. And suddenly it's accepted with great enthusiasm. And I really believe that didn't happen. I heard that research, and I really believe that didn't happen until I started teaching at Western. And we had a weekly meeting where we sat around a table, and the women, there were very few very few women in that group, a much larger number of men who had more seniority as well. And it happened over and over again, and I found it quite astounding. So these are the kinds of things that can happen. It also skewed the distribution of power and privilege, and it skewed forms of institutional and social change in schools because of this pushback to reforms that women tried to bring. Some of them were successful, and a lot of them weren't. So, what are the possibilities for change? Well, we should be able, he contends, to deconstruct the errors of the past while retaining what does work, because there are strengths to the bureaucratic model. It is more efficient. It is more effective in certain kinds of ways, but it is inequitable. So he argues for a neo-bureaucracy that would have limited task specialization. So who can do the work? And that person then can be elevated to that particular task. We can acknowledge areas of expertise that are shared, and rather than one person or a small group of people getting the lion's share of the praise and the attention, we can share that attention to those who share the expertise. We can accent teamwork and group achievement. We can ensure that special roles are taken up by allocations of personnel to solve problems. And we can rethink how bureaucracies work. Does it have to be just those things that have been stated by the bureaucracy? Do the rules have to be followed all the time, or can there be some movement for flexibility, so an adhocracy, in other words? Can we decentralize power? Can we share power? Can decision making be made through consensus around very important issues? Staff participation, of course, has to be a part of this, and there needs to be continual critical dialogue. Now, we might think that that's impossible, but I remember when I was teaching at UVic one summer, and we had a visitor from Switzerland. And I don't know whether the model is still the same. This was several years ago now. But she was there to learn more about the North American way of organizing schools. And then so we asked, well, tell us about your school and schools in your area. And they didn't have a principal like we would have a principal. They shared that role. So now the schools were somewhat smaller than many of our mega schools, but not all of them were. But this model was the one that was chosen. So for example, depending on the size of the school, 1 or 2, 3 of the teachers would be chosen, or however they decided, that they would take on that role for the next 2 or 3 years. and it would be decided how much time they would do that to make it effective. And the whole staff would decide this. Then when they had had their share of responsibility, then someone else would come along and they would return to teaching. So these kinds of models do exist, and they do exist quite successfully. So it is possible. It's maybe not probable given the way in which bureaucracy is so deeply entrenched, but nevertheless, there are models for change. And as we become more aware of how bureaucracies entrench these gendered models and entrench unfair practices that are inequitable, then we may be able to propose change as well.